There is something about cigarettes in the early 1980s that reveals how different childhood was back then. The ease of access, the cultural attitudes, the complete absence of barriers that exist today. If someone grew up in Canada during those years, they remember exactly how normal it seemed. This was a time when a teenager could walk into a corner store and buy cigarettes without anyone batting an eye. Du Maurier was one of the most popular brands, sitting on shelves next to the candy and comic books. The price was manageable, around 1 to 150 Canadian for a pack of 20. For kids pooling their allowance money, that was achievable. This was the decade before warning labels covered half the package, before graphic images of diseased lungs appeared on every carton, before society collectively decided that protecting children from tobacco was a serious priority. This was an era when smoking was everywhere. Teachers smoked in staff rooms. Parents smoked at the dinner table. Cigarette vending machines sat in restaurant lobbies where any child could use them. Being a teenager in Canada in the early 1980s meant navigating a world where cigarettes were as accessible as chocolate bars, and adults seemed largely unconcerned about it. Let's walk through what that reality actually looked like during those years. Some of this might bring back memories for those who lived it. Some of it reveals just how dramatically things have changed in 4 decades. Let's step into that world. The culture around smoking in the early 1980s was fundamentally different from today. Smoking was normal, visible, and socially acceptable in ways that seem unimaginable now. Cigarette advertisements were everywhere. Billboards featured the Marlboro Man. Magazines had full-page ads showing glamorous people smoking. Television commercials for cigarettes had been banned in Canada since 1972, but print advertising remained aggressive and everywhere. Sponsorships were massive. Canadian racing events, concerts, and sporting competitions prominently featured tobacco brand names. Du Maurier sponsored major tennis tournaments. Players Cigarettes sponsored the Players International. These brands were woven into the fabric of Canadian culture and entertainment. Smoking sections existed in restaurants, but they were not really separate. A non-smoking section might just be a few tables away from the smoking area, with smoke drifting freely between them. Airplanes still had smoking sections. Imagine sitting in the back half of a plane where everyone around you was smoking for hours. Buses had smoking areas. Even hospitals allowed smoking in certain areas. The idea that secondhand smoke was genuinely dangerous was only beginning to gain traction. Most adults knew smoking was bad for the smoker, but the concept that it harmed others nearby was not widely accepted. This created an environment where smoking around children was common and not considered particularly irresponsible. Teachers would step outside between classes to smoke. Some schools had designated smoking areas for students, usually seniors, though enforcement was inconsistent. The message to teenagers was mixed. Adults would tell kids not to smoke, but those same adults smoked constantly. The hypocrisy was obvious to every teenager. If the adults doing the warning were themselves addicted, how serious could the danger really be? This contradiction undermined anti-smoking messages and made cigarettes seem like a normal part of growing up rather than a serious health threat. Du Maurier was one of the premium brands in Canada during the early 1980s. The packaging was elegant, with gold and blue colors that suggested sophistication. The brand marketed itself as higher quality, a step above discount brands. For teenagers who smoked, having a pack of Du Maurier rather than a cheaper brand carried a certain status. These were not the cigarettes you bummed off someone or bought when desperate. These were cigarettes you chose. The price reflected that positioning. While discount brands might be slightly cheaper, Du Maurier sat in the range of $1 to $1.50 for a pack of 20 cigarettes. That price point made them accessible but not quite throwaway cheap. To understand what that meant in real terms, consider what else cost around $1 in the early 1980s. A McDonald's hamburger was about 50 cents. A can of Coke from a vending machine was around 50 cents. A comic book cost 60 cents to a dollar. A movie ticket for a teenager might be $3 or $4. So a pack of cigarettes represented a meaningful purchase, but not an impossible one. A teenager with a part-time job could afford cigarettes. Even without a job, allowance money or lunch money could be redirected. If 3 or 4 friends pooled their money, buying a pack to share became easy. The tax structure on cigarettes in Canada was beginning to increase during the early 1980s, but it was nothing like today. Provincial and federal taxes existed, but they were modest. The government was starting to recognize tobacco as a public health issue, but the financial incentive to dramatically increase taxes had not yet materialized. This kept prices relatively stable and affordable. The idea of using taxation as a tool to discourage smoking was emerging, but it had not yet become aggressive policy. Cigarettes were still treated more like a regular consumer product than a public health crisis. Where teenagers bought cigarettes reveals the most about how different things were. The law in most Canadian provinces set 16 as the minimum age to purchase tobacco. This law existed on paper, but enforcement was practically non-existent. Studies from the mid-1980s showed that the vast majority of children aged 8 to 15 who wanted cigarettes bought them directly from stores without difficulty. Think about that. 8-year-olds walking into stores, buying cigarettes, and succeeding most of the time. This was not some underground network or black market. This was regular retail. Corner stores were the most common source. These small neighborhood shops sold everything from milk and bread to magazines and candy. Cigarettes sat behind the counter in large displays. A teenager would walk in, ask for a pack of Maurier, put money on the counter, and walk out. Most clerks did not ask for identification. Many did not even seem to think about it. The attitude seemed to be that if a kid was bold enough to ask and had the money, why make it complicated? Some clerks might have assumed the cigarettes were for a parent. Others probably knew exactly what was happening and just did not care. The law was not enforced, there were no penalties, and refusing the sale meant losing revenue. Grocery stores were another major source. Larger than corner stores but still community-oriented, these stores had cigarettes available at checkout counters or customer service desks. The same lack of enforcement applied. A teenager buying groceries for their family could add a pack of cigarettes to the order without question. The anonymity of a busy grocery store made it even easier. Clerks were processing dozens of customers per hour and were not playing detective about who might be underage. Newsstands and convenience stores at gas stations also sold cigarettes freely. These locations often had even less oversight. A teenager stopping in to buy a chocolate bar could just as easily buy cigarettes. The transaction took seconds. There was no procedure, no checking identification, no verification process. The entire system operated on the assumption that adults were buying, even when that was obviously not the case. Vending machines represented the most accessible source of all. These machines existed in restaurants, bowling alleys, bars, and even some public spaces. They required no human interaction whatsoever. A kid would insert money, pull a lever, and receive cigarettes. No questions, no eye contact, no judgment. Vending machines were supposed to be restricted to adult-only locations, but that rule was loosely interpreted and rarely enforced. A bowling alley might have families and teenagers, but it also had a cigarette vending machine. A restaurant lobby might be fully accessible to children, but the machine was right there next to the payphone. For teenagers, vending machines were perfect. They eliminated the one variable that might prevent a sale, which was an adult deciding to enforce the age restriction. With a machine, all you needed was the right coins. The coins themselves were not hard to come by. Allowances, part-time jobs, lunch money, birthday gifts, all provided the $1 or $1.50 needed. Some teenagers would collect bottles for the deposit refund and use that money. Others would do odd jobs around the neighborhood. The financial barrier was low enough that most teenagers who wanted cigarettes could afford them, at least occasionally. Sharing was common. A group of friends might pool money to buy a pack and split it. This made the individual cost even lower and created a social dynamic around smoking that reinforced the behavior. Parents were often surprisingly unaware or unconcerned. Some parents smoked heavily themselves and were desensitized to the smell. A teenager coming home smelling like smoke might not even register. If confronted, kids had ready excuses. They were around friends who smoked. Someone else was smoking nearby. The smell transferred from someone's jacket. Because smoking was so prevalent in society, these excuses were plausible. Some parents who discovered their teenagers smoking would be upset, but the consequences were often minimal. This was not seen as a crisis requiring intervention. It was seen as typical teenage rebellion, something that might pass. Other parents took a pragmatic approach. They knew their teenager was smoking and figured that forbidding it would just drive it underground. They might set rules like no smoking in the house or you have to buy your own cigarettes, but they did not actively try to stop it. A few parents even bought cigarettes for their teenagers, reasoning that it was safer to know where the cigarettes came from than to have their kid buying from strangers or stealing. This attitude reflected the broader cultural acceptance of smoking. It was not ideal, but it was not catastrophic either. Schools had policies against smoking, but enforcement was inconsistent. Some high schools designated smoking areas for students 17 and older, creating a sanctioned space for what was technically illegal, since the legal age was 16 and many seniors were not yet 16. Other schools banned smoking entirely but had limited ability to stop it. Students would smoke in bathrooms behind the school building or off school property. Teachers and administrators knew it was happening, but had limited tools to address it. Suspending a student for smoking seemed excessive when half the teaching staff smoked in the staff room. The mixed messages continued. The health education around smoking was beginning to emerge in the early 1980s, but was not yet comprehensive. Students might have a single health class that mentioned smoking as bad for your lungs. Some schools brought in speakers or showed films about the dangers of tobacco. But this education competed with constant cultural messages that smoking was normal, sophisticated, and adult. For every health class warning about cancer, there were dozens of images in media and daily life showing attractive, successful people smoking. The cultural messages overwhelmed the educational ones. Peer pressure played an enormous role. If a teenager's friends smoked, the pressure to join in was intense. Smoking was a social activity, a bonding ritual, a way to fit in. The teenager who refused to smoke might be seen as uptight, scared, or immature. The desire to belong often outweighed concerns about health, especially when the health consequences seemed distant and abstract. Lung cancer and emphysema were problems for old people decades in the future. Fitting in with friends was an immediate, pressing need. The psychology of adolescence made the short-term social benefits far more compelling than long-term health risks. The addictive nature of nicotine was understood by scientists but not widely communicated to the public. Teenagers who started smoking casually often found themselves addicted within weeks or months. What began as occasional social smoking at parties became a daily habit. The cigarette companies understood this perfectly. Their internal research showed that hooking customers young created lifelong users. The earlier someone started smoking, the harder it was to quit and the more years of purchasing they represented. This was not accidental. The accessibility to teenagers was profitable, and the industry resisted any efforts to restrict it. Regional differences existed across Canada. Some provinces were slightly stricter than others, but the overall pattern was similar. British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, Alberta all had laws on the books about minimum age for tobacco purchase, and all had similar failures in enforcement. Rural areas might have even less oversight than cities, though cities provided more anonymity. A teenager in a small town might know the clerk at the only convenience store, which could make buying cigarettes awkward but not impossible. In a city, there were dozens of stores and no one knew anyone. The early 1980s represented a peak moment for youth smoking in Canada. Rates were high, access was easy, and cultural attitudes had not yet shifted. But change was coming. Research was mounting about the dangers of smoking, and especially secondhand smoke. Advocacy groups were organizing. The medical community was becoming more vocal. Governments were beginning to consider more aggressive action. By the end of the decade, things would start to shift. But in the early years, from 1981 to 1985, the old system was still fully in place. Looking back at this era from today's perspective creates a sense of disbelief. How could society have been so casual about children accessing cigarettes? How could stores have sold them so freely? How could parents have been so uninvolved? The answers lie in understanding how normalized smoking was. When everyone smokes, when it is everywhere, when the culture treats it as a normal part of life, the idea of rigorously protecting children from it does not emerge. The problem seems individual rather than systemic. It is about bad choices by individuals rather than a public health crisis requiring intervention. The economic aspect cannot be ignored. Tobacco was a massive industry generating significant tax revenue and employment. Politicians were reluctant to crack down too hard on an industry that contributed so much economically. Retailers made money from cigarette sales and did not want to lose that revenue. But the entire system had financial incentives to maintain the status quo. Children accessing cigarettes was not seen as a crisis requiring urgent action. It was seen as an unfortunate side effect of a generally accepted product being available. The shift that occurred later in the 1980s and into the 1990s was driven by multiple factors. Research on secondhand smoke made it harder to argue that smoking was only a personal choice. If smoking harmed others, especially children, the moral calculus changed. Addiction research revealed how the tobacco industry had deliberately targeted young people, creating public outrage. The cost to the healthcare system became impossible to ignore as smoking-related diseases mounted. Economic arguments emerged that the long-term costs outweighed the short-term revenue. Cultural attitudes shifted as smoking became associated with lower education and income levels, losing its glamorous image. But in the early 1980s, that shift had not yet happened. For teenagers growing up then, buying cigarettes was easy. Maurier, with its elegant packaging and premium positioning, was a popular choice. The price of $1 to $150 per pack was manageable. Corner stores, grocery stores, newsstands, and vending machines all provided access without meaningful age verification. Parents were often unaware or took a permissive approach. Schools had policies but limited enforcement. Society as a whole had not yet decided that protecting children from tobacco was a serious priority. The stories from people who grew up during this time reflect this reality. Someone who was 14 in 1983 might remember walking into their neighborhood convenience store and buying cigarettes for the first time. Nervous but successful. They remember the clerk barely looking at them, taking the money, handing over the pack. They remember the mix of excitement and guilt, feeling adult and rebellious, but also aware they were doing something their parents would not approve of. They remember sharing that first pack with friends behind the school or in someone's garage, coughing through the early attempts but persisting because everyone else was doing it. These memories are complicated. There is nostalgia for the freedom and the sense of independence, mixed with regret about starting a habit that many struggled for years to quit. There is recognition that things were different then, that the culture was different, that what seemed normal at the time now seems irresponsible. There is an understanding that the ease of access had consequences, that many people became addicted as teenagers and suffered health problems as adults. The personal stories are part of a larger social story about how attitudes towards smoking fundamentally changed. The public health victory of reducing youth smoking rates over the subsequent decades required changing all the factors that made access easy in the early 1980s. It required enforcing age verification laws with real penalties for retailers who sold to minors. It required eliminating vending machines or moving them to adults-only locations with strict controls. It required massive increases in tobacco taxes to make cigarettes financially prohibitive for teenagers. It required comprehensive health education that started early and was reinforced consistently. It required changing cultural attitudes so that smoking lost its association with sophistication and adulthood. It required restricting where people could smoke to make the behavior less visible and normalized. All of that took time, effort, money, and political will. In 1981 to 1985, none of it had happened yet. The old system was still in place. Teenagers could and did buy cigarettes easily. Maurier was one of many brands available to anyone with $1.50 and the willingness to walk into a store or approach a vending machine. The cultural acceptance of smoking meant that even when adults knew teenagers were smoking, the response was often muted. This was seen as a normal part of adolescence rather than a preventable public health problem. For those with memories of this era, whether as teenagers who smoked or as adults who witnessed the easy access, there is a recognition of how much has changed. The early 1980s feel like a different country when it comes to tobacco. The freedom that teenagers had, the lack of barriers, the cultural acceptance, all of it has been dismantled. Today's teenagers face a completely different landscape. Cigarettes are expensive, hidden behind barriers at checkout counters, require identification to purchase, and carry graphic health warnings. Vending machines are essentially extinct. Smoking is banned in most public spaces. Cultural attitudes have shifted so dramatically that smoking is now often seen as low status, rather than sophisticated. This transformation represents one of the major public health successes of the past 4 decades. Youth smoking rates in Canada have dropped dramatically. The easy access that characterized the early 1980s has been eliminated. The system that allowed 8-year-olds to buy cigarettes from corner stores has been completely overhauled. But understanding how things were helps appreciate how much intentional change was required. It did not happen naturally or automatically. It required recognizing a problem, building political will, implementing policies, enforcing laws, changing culture, and sustaining effort over decades. The price of Maurier cigarettes in the early 1980s, around $1 to $150 per pack, seems impossibly cheap today. A pack of cigarettes in Canada now costs $15 to $20 depending on the province. That price difference is almost entirely due to taxation designed to discourage smoking. The stores where teenagers bought cigarettes so easily now face serious penalties for selling to minors, with enforcement taken seriously. The vending machines that required no human interaction are gone. The cultural landscape where smoking was everywhere and accepted has been replaced by one where smoking is increasingly marginalized. For those who lived through it, the early 1980s represent a time capsule of different attitudes and different systems. The memories of buying cigarettes as a teenager, whether du Maurier or any other brand, are memories of a world that no longer exists. That world was shaped by different understandings of health, different cultural norms, different economic priorities, and different levels of concern about protecting children. Recognizing how different things were is not about nostalgia or about celebrating easy access to tobacco. It is about understanding how societies change, how public health priorities evolve, and how persistent effort can transform systems that once seemed unchangeable. The story of cigarette access in Canada in the early 1980s is part of the larger story of how the country has changed over the past 4 decades. It sits alongside stories about constitutional changes, economic transformations, technological evolution, and cultural shifts. Each piece helps create a picture of a country finding its way, making mistakes, learning, and changing. For those curious about this history, there is always more to explore and understand about how Canada became what it is today. If you found this look back at cigarette culture in early 1980s Canada interesting and want to explore more about how life has changed over the decades, consider subscribing to see more stories from Canada's past. And leave a comment below sharing your own memories or thoughts about how different things were back then. What else from that era do you remember that seems unbelievable now? Let's keep the conversation going about how much our world has transformed.